The search party found her by the smoke. It was a thin thread of it, barely visible against the white January sky, rising from what looked like nothing more than a low mound of snow-covered earth at the far edge of the Callahan claim. 12 inches of snow had fallen in 3 days and then stayed, and the landscape of southeastern Iowa Territory had become a uniform white surface that erased every distinction between road and field and creek bank. The men had been walking for 40 minutes, wading through knee-deep drifts, their breath solidifying into frost on their scarves, certain that what they would find when they reached the girl's claim was a frozen body in a collapsed structure. What they found was a door. It was set into the side of the earthen mound at ground level, a low rectangle of board fitted in a frame of hewn willow, its edges packed with twisted grass to keep the wind out. Above the door, the mound rose about 4 feet. Smoke came from a clay pipe emerging from the top of the mound. Not the aggressive black column of a fire burning desperate and hot, but a thin, pale wisp, the smoke of a fire that was doing its job steadily and without crisis. Niels Bergstrom, who had organized the search party, reached the door first. He knocked on it with his fist, a strange gesture given that it was a door set into what appeared to be a hill, and called out. After a moment, the wooden bar inside scraped back and the door opened. The girl was 16 years old, with a red-brown braid over one shoulder and flour on her hands. Behind her, the interior of the mound was lit by a grease lamp hung from the ceiling, and Niels could see a table, a stovepipe, a sleeping platform of willow poles, and a row of clay jars on a shelf. The air that rolled out through the open door was warm, not the scorching warmth of a fire burning at full intensity, but the steady, even warmth of a space that had been warm for a long time and intended to stay that way. Niels stood in the cold outside the door and looked at the girl, and felt the warm air on his face and tried to find words for what he was experiencing. "How cold is it in there?" he asked. She stepped aside to let him in. "See for yourself," she said. He had a thermometer in his coat pocket. He carried it because he kept records, the kind of man who measured things because he believed that measurements told the truth, even when people preferred not to. He took it out and held it in the warm air of the interior and watched the mercury. It read 51 degrees. Niels looked at the thermometer for a long moment. Outside, it was -4 degrees Fahrenheit. The temperature differential between the mound interior and the Iowa Territory air was 55 degrees. In his own frame house, with a full fire burning, the interior temperature on a morning like this was 38 degrees. He had checked it before he left. He looked at the girl standing in her own warm space, watching him with an expression that was not quite pride and not quite patience, but something between the two. "How?" he said. She said, "Sit down. It takes a while to explain." His name was Niels Bergstrom, and he was 47 years old, and he had been farming in Iowa Territory for 8 years, and he thought he understood what the prairie could and could not offer a person who was trying to build a life on it. He was wrong about that. He had been wrong since August, when a 16-year-old girl arrived at the edge of the Callahan claim with $2 and some cents in her pocket, and everyone in the settlement at Ridge Fork agreed it was only a matter of time. They were right that it was a matter of time. They were wrong about what time would deliver. This is the story of how Ingrid Sorensen, thrown off her uncle's claim at 16 with less money than a bushel of oats, built the warmest structure in southeastern Iowa Territory for $2.11, and changed how the settlement at Ridge Fork thought about what it meant to be poor on the frontier. Carl Sorensen was 52 years old, widowed twice, with a proved-up claim in Ridge Fork Township that he had been farming for 6 years. He was Ingrid's father's older brother, which made him her only living blood relation in the territory after her parents died of cholera on the river crossing in the spring of 1856. The letter that told Carl about his brother's death also told him that Ingrid was on her way, that she had caught a wagon west with a family traveling to the territory and that she would arrive at his claim within the month. Carl's reaction to this letter was complicated. He had not seen his brother in 11 years, had not seen Ingrid since she was 5. He was not a cruel man. He was a man with a claim, a working farm, and a very clear understanding of what an extra mouth cost in a place where everything had to be grown or bought, and the margin between sufficiency and shortage was measured in weeks rather than months. He made a decision. He would take the girl in until she could find a situation, meaning a household that needed domestic labor in exchange for room and board. He would feed her and shelter her through the summer, and he would find her a place by autumn. This was generous by frontier standards, and Carl knew it. Ingrid arrived in June of 1856. She was 15 years old, tall for her age, with the particular self-contained stillness of a young person who has had grief happen to them recently enough that they are still integrating it. She said very little. She worked hard. She learned what needed to be learned about the claim and did it without being told twice. Carl watched her and revised his estimate of the cost of keeping her upward and the cost of losing her downward, but not enough to change the underlying arithmetic. In late August, he told her that Widow Hansen, 4 miles south, needed a girl to help through the winter. The arrangement was room and board in exchange for domestic work, which was standard and fair, and Ingrid could begin in September. Ingrid looked at him for a moment and said, "What about the spring?" Carl said, "What about it?" She said, "If I go to Widow Hansen, I spend the winter working for room and board. In the spring I have what I came with, which is nothing. That's not a plan that goes anywhere." Carl said, "It goes to the next winter." She said, "I want to file on a claim." Carl looked at her. She was 15 years old, and she was telling him she wanted to file a homestead claim, which required being 21 years of age or the head of a household, which she was neither. She said, "I know I can't file yet, but if I can establish on a claim before winter, be there through the winter, prove that I can work it, then when I turn 21 I have something. Widow Hansen doesn't give me anything except the next year's starting point." Carl said, "You have nowhere to file. You have no money and nowhere to go." She said, "There's the old Callahan claim. No one filed it after Martin Callahan left." Carl said, "Because it's been abandoned for 2 seasons and the improvements are gone. There's nothing left on it but the well casing and a hole where the soddy was." She said, "That's enough." Carl looked at her for a long time. She looked back. She was not defiant. She was not asking for anything. She was simply presenting him with the facts of her situation and her plan for addressing them and waiting to see what he would do. Carl said, "I have $2 and some change I can give you. That's all I can do." She said, "That's enough too." She left on a Tuesday in the first week of September. Carl gave her $2.11, a cast-iron cookpot, a 20-pound sack of cornmeal, a hand axe and a wool blanket. He also gave her the broken-handled spade that had been sitting against the barn wall for 2 years since the handle cracked, because he could not think of anything else, and he could tell she was going to need it. He watched her walk east toward the Callahan claim with everything she had on her back or in her hands, and felt something that was not quite guilt and not quite relief but was somewhere between the two. And then he went back to his field work because the corn needed to come in. Ingrid Sorensen walked the 4 miles to the abandoned Callahan claim and arrived in the late afternoon of a Tuesday in September 1856 and looked at what she had to work with. The claim was 160 acres of Iowa prairie, its boundaries marked by surveyor stakes that were still visible, which was something. The Callahan soddy had collapsed inward when the roof poles rotted through, which left a rectangular depression in the ground where the structure had been, approximately 12 feet by 16 feet, with the remnants of the original sod walls visible as low ridges around the perimeter. The well casing was intact, a timber-lined shaft 10 feet deep with a small amount of clear water at the bottom. There was a shallow creek running along the eastern boundary, its banks overgrown with willow and cottonwood. She set her things down beside the well and looked at the collapsed soddy for a long time. The original builders had dug down about 3 feet before starting their walls, which was standard for a dugout-style soddy. That 3-foot depth still existed, a rectangular pit with walls of compressed earth on 3 sides, and the remnants of the sod bricks that had been the above-ground portion collapsed inward and filling the center. She climbed down into the pit and walked the dimensions and tested the soil walls and found them solid, the way walls of compacted earth become solid when they have been standing for several seasons and the grass roots have knitted through them. She was not a builder. She had never built anything larger than a chicken coop, but she had watched her father construct the root cellar behind their Missouri house when she was 11, had watched him cut the sod bricks and stack them, and understood the principle of how sod worked as a building material. She had also, that spring, helped Widow Hanson bank the exterior of her soddy against the winter cold with additional sod, and listened to the widow explain why. The sod held heat. The grass roots locked the bricks together into something that behaved less like stacked dirt and more like solid wall. The thicker the wall, the more heat it held, and the more heat it held, the less fuel you needed to maintain a livable temperature inside. Ingrid stood in the pit of the old Callahan soddy and did arithmetic. She had $2.11. She had roughly 12 weeks before the first hard freeze. She had a depression in the ground that was already 3 feet below the frost line depth for Iowa territory. She had a foundation. She did not need to dig one. The question was how small she could build and still survive. This was not a rhetorical question. It was the most practical question she had ever asked herself, and she sat in the pit with her blanket around her shoulders in the September afternoon and thought it through with the methodical care of someone who understood that getting the answer wrong was not an inconvenience, but an end. A standard soddy for a family ran 12 by 16 feet with walls 7 feet above ground. She had no family. She needed space for a stove, a sleeping platform, food storage, and herself. She needed walls thick enough to insulate properly, and she needed the roof low enough that she could build it alone, which meant as short a span as possible. She drew in the dirt with a stick, 8 feet by 10 feet interior, walls 2.5 feet thick. The existing depression gave her 3 feet of depth, which meant she only needed the walls to rise 3.5 feet above the surface to give her a 6.5 foot interior height. That was workable. That was survivable. She counted the sod bricks she would need. The calculation took her an hour, and she checked it twice because she was the kind of person who checked her calculations twice. She needed approximately 140 bricks for the above-ground portion, assuming the existing pit walls served as the below-grade foundation. Each brick weighed between 40 and 50 pounds dry, more when wet. She could cut perhaps 20 bricks a day working alone without a plow, which meant 1 week of cutting, even if conditions stayed good. She did not have a plow. She had a broken-handled spade. This was the central problem. A standard sod-breaking plow cut the prairie grass in long strips that were then cross-cut into bricks. Without a plow, she had to cut each brick individually by hand, driving the spade down through the dense root mat at the required dimensions and then prying the brick free. It was slower and harder and required more precision to get bricks of consistent size that would stack without gaps. She sharpened the spade with the whetstone from the creek bottom and started cutting on Wednesday morning. The Iowa prairie sod was the densest she had encountered. The root system of the native bluestem and switchgrass ran 4 to 6 feet deep in some places, and the root mass in the top 12 inches was so tightly woven that the first brick she cut came up in one solid piece that held its shape when she set it on the ground. The top surface brown-green grass, and the bottom a matted tangle of pale roots trailing clumps of dark earth. Each brick weighed about 45 pounds. she could carry one at a time. She set herself a pace, cut 6 bricks, haul them to the building site, cut 6 more. The hauling was the limiting factor because the cutting area and the building site were 30 feet apart and the ground was uneven. By midday, on the first day, she had 22 bricks cut and stacked at the site, and her hands were cramping from gripping the spade handle, and her back had established a complaint that she recognized as the complaint of someone who would be doing this for a week and needed to decide now whether to let it stop them. She decided not to let it stop her. On the 3rd day of cutting, she went to the settlement at Ridge Fork Trading Post. This was a 4-mile walk each way, and she did it in the early morning to save the working daylight. The trading post was run by a man named Aldous Kipp, who was 60 years old and had been trading on the Iowa frontier for 20 years and had seen approximately everything a person could arrive at a trading post needing. He watched Ingrid Sorensen come through the door and mentally categorized her. Young, alone, working-class German-Scandinavian stock by her bone structure, recently arrived given the lack of a settled look about her. He said nothing and waited. She told him what she had, $2.11. She told him what she needed. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "Tar paper. You need tar paper for the roof layer under the sod, or it'll leak every thaw for the next 6 years. A roll of tar paper is 30 cents. She said, "What's left if I buy the tar paper?" He did his own arithmetic, $1.81. She said, "I need nails for the door frame and the roof poles. I need a window pane if there's one that size, and I need enough rope to lash the roof poles." He walked her through the inventory. He did not overcharge her. He had been on the frontier long enough to understand that overcharging desperate people was not good business, because desperate people either died or succeeded. And if they succeeded, they remembered who had treated them fairly. And if they died, it reflected poorly on the settlement. She left the trading post with a roll of tar paper, a pound of cut nails, 40 feet of hemp rope, and a small glass window pane 4 inches by 8 inches that Aldous Kipp had given her for 6 cents on the stated grounds that it was scratched and he couldn't sell it to anyone else. She had 19 cents left, which she kept in the pocket of her skirt. She had $2.11 when she arrived. She had spent $1.92. The building materials for the most important structure of her life had cost less than a pair of boots. The cutting took 9 days, not 7. It rained on the 4th day, turning the prairie surface to a mud that made the spade slip and the bricks crumble at the edges, and she lost the day to weather and spent it instead clearing debris from the pit and planning the wall layout. By the end of the 9th day, she had 156 bricks cut and stacked beside the pit, enough for the walls, with 12 extra for contingency. The stacking required different knowledge than the cutting. Her father had explained the principle of brick coursing when he built the root cellar, each course offset from the one below by half a brick length, the way proper brick walls were laid, so that no vertical joint ran continuously from bottom to top. A continuous vertical joint was a weakness. Alternating joints meant the wall behaved as a single mass rather than a stack of individual pieces. The grass roots in the sod bricks would grow together over time and lock the courses further, but the mechanical offset was the foundation of the strength. She started with the corners because the corners were the most technically demanding, and if she got them wrong, the whole structure would be wrong. She cut special corner pieces, bricks trimmed to half length, that allowed the alternating pattern to wrap the angle cleanly. This took longer than she expected and used 3 of her 12 contingency bricks, leaving 9. The walls rose in 4 days. First course, second course, third. Each course was 4 inches of height. By the end of the 3rd day, the walls were 18 inches above the surface, and she could feel the structure becoming real, becoming a thing with presence and dimension rather than a series of calculations in her head. By the end of the 4th day, The walls were 30 inches above the surface, just under 3 feet, and the total wall height, including the 3-foot depth of the pit, was 6 feet and 6 inches. She was not going to make it the way she had hoped. The walls were solid, and the coursing was correct, and the corners were true, but the sheer physical labor of cutting, hauling, and stacking 156 bricks by herself over 2 weeks had taken more from her than she had expected it to take. She was thinner. Her hands had gone past blistered and past calloused to something that felt like leather. She ate cornmeal porridge 3 times a day, and it was enough to keep working, but not enough to recover. She built the roof on the 14th day. She had gathered willow poles from the creek bank during the week, cutting them with the hand axe in the evenings when the light was too poor for brickwork, selecting the straightest ones and sorting them by length. The longest were 10 feet, which she needed to span the 8-foot interior plus seat properly on the wall tops. She laid them across the short dimension of the structure, spacing them about 8 inches apart, and lashed them to the wall-top bricks with the hemp rope. Over the poles, she laid a layer of brush, cottonwood branches interlocked to fill the gaps between poles. Over the brush went the tar paper, overlapping in 2 layers, running from the ridge pole she had lashed along the peak down to the wall edges on both sides. Over the tar paper went sod. She had cut an additional 40 bricks specifically for the roof, thinner than the wall bricks, about 2 inches thick, which made them lighter. She laid them grass side down over the tar paper in overlapping courses the way shingles were laid, each course overlapping the one below, the grass roots of each brick locking with the roots of the brick touching it. She finished the roof at midday on the 14th day and stood outside the structure and looked at what she had built. It looked like a hill, a low rectangular hill with a door frame opening on the south side and a clay pipe sticking out of the ridge. If you did not know it was there and were not looking for it, you might ride past it on the road and see nothing but prairie. She thought about this for a moment. She decided it was not a flaw. She built the door from boards she had salvaged from the collapsed Callahan outbuilding, a plank structure that had been a small storage shed and had rotted through at the foundation, but left its boards mostly sound. She trimmed them with the hand axe and fitted them into the door frame she had assembled from 3 of the straightest willow poles, nailed together at the corners with her cut nails. The door hung on leather hinges she cut from a scrap of harness leather she found in the shed debris. It was rough, uneven at the edges, and the latch was a wooden bar set in 2 bent nail guides. It closed well enough to keep the wind out, which was the only specification that mattered. She installed the small, scratched glass window pane into the south wall on the east side of the door, cutting an opening in the sod with the hand axe and fitting the glass into a frame she built from willow pole scraps. She sealed the edges with wet clay, pressed into the gap between the glass and the sod, and smoothed it flat with her thumb. When the clay dried, it held the glass firmly. She stepped back and looked at her window and thought it was the most valuable thing on the claim. She moved in on the 15th day. The cast-iron cookpot she had brought from Carl's went on the small stone hearth she had built in the northwest corner, using flat stones from the creek and clay mortar. She hung the grease lamp from a willow pole nail driven into the ceiling. She built the sleeping platform from the remaining salvaged boards, a simple frame raised 8 inches off the earth floor. She arranged the cornmeal sack, the water bucket, and the clay pots she had made herself on the shelf she had cut into the sod wall on the east side, a natural ledge formed by the thickness of the wall that served as shelving without any additional construction. On the first night, she built a fire in the stone hearth using willow branches and dry grass. The smoke went up the clay pipe without backing. The fire was small, the size of a man's hat. She watched the interior temperature change. She did not have a thermometer, but she had her body, which was a reliable instrument in the way that bodies are reliable instruments for the things they have been calibrated to measure. She felt the air in the soddy change from the ambient cool of packed earth, which was 50 to 52 degrees, to something warmer. Within an hour of starting the fire, the interior was warm enough that she took off her coat. Within 2 hours, she was sitting at her small table in her regular dress, writing in the account book she had kept since she was 13, the one that tracked what she had and what she had spent, and what she owed and what was owed to her. The account book showed total construction cost, $1.92. Total materials purchased, tar paper, nails, rope, 1 window pane. Everything else, free from the prairie. She closed the account book and went to sleep on the willow platform under her wool blanket, and the prairie darkness settled over the sod mound from the outside, and inside it was warm. October came with frosts that arrived earlier than the old-timers at the Ridge Fork trading post said they should. The nights dropped into the 20s, and the days barely reached 40, and the prairie grasses went brown and stiff, and the sky went from the clear blue of summer to the particular flat grey of Iowa autumn that made the horizon look like a wall closing in. Ingrid maintained the fire in the stone hearth for 2 hours each morning and 2 hours each evening, and let the sod walls do the rest. This was not the accident it might appear to be. She had thought carefully about the thermal principle her father had explained during the root cellar construction. A thick mass of material with low thermal conductivity, meaning a material that was slow to absorb heat and slow to release it, would moderate temperature extremes in both directions. In summer, a thick sod wall stayed cool when the air outside was hot. In winter, it stayed warm when the air outside was cold. The key was the mass and the thickness, not the material itself. 2.5 feet of packed earth and grass roots was a very large thermal mass indeed. The fire was not heating the air. The fire was heating the walls, and the walls, once warm, would stay warm for hours after the fire died, giving back what they had taken in the same way a stone sitting in the sun gives back warmth after the sun goes down. She had calculated roughly that her sod walls represented somewhere between 4 and 5 tons of thermal mass. The clay hearth itself, the stone floor she had laid over the packed earth in the central area of the soddy, and the sod roof above represented additional mass. All of it absorbed heat and released it slowly, evening out the sharp temperature swings between fire and no fire that made frame structures so difficult to heat through the night. She burned approximately 1 armload of willow branches per fire session, 2 sessions per day, 2 armloads per day. Her wood pile from the creek bottom cutting she had done through October was sufficient for the winter she had planned for. Her neighbor to the north, a German farmer named Werner Haas, who had been in Iowa Territory for 4 years, burned through approximately 8 to 10 armloads of wood per day in his frame house, which had 2-inch board walls and a single iron stove. She knew this from visiting his claim in October to borrow a sharpening stone. She had seen the woodpile, which was substantial but not excessive, and had watched him go to it 3 times in the 2 hours she was there. She said nothing about her own wood consumption. She was 16 years old and had been in the territory for 3 months and had no standing to offer farming advice to a man who had been there for 4 years. November arrived, and with it the first real cold, the kind that settled over Iowa Territory like something taking up permanent residence. Temperatures in the nights dropped to 10 degrees, to 5, to below 0 on the worst nights. The prairie hardened to something that sounded like stone when you struck it. The creek edges froze, and then the creek center froze, and then the entire creek was a white road cutting through the brown and white landscape. Inside the sod mound, the interior temperature held between 48 and 54 degrees without any fire. With the morning and evening fires, it rose to 64 and held there through the night. Ingrid sat at her table in the evenings and read by grease lamp light, books she had borrowed from Aldous Kip at the trading post, who kept a small shelf of them. And she was not cold. She wore an extra wool shirt over her dress. She had her blanket around her shoulders while she read. She was not cold. Werner Haas burned through his November woodpile 2 weeks early and had to make an emergency trip to the creek bottom to cut more. His wife, Greta, mentioned this to Ingrid when Ingrid came by to return the sharpening stone in early December. Greta was 45, practical, direct. She asked how Ingrid was managing for fuel. Ingrid said she was fine. Greta said, "You can't be burning much. I haven't seen your smoke much in the evenings." "I bank the fire in the morning," Ingrid said. "The walls hold it through the day." Greta Haas looked at her for a moment. Werner had told her about the sod mound, had described it as a rabbit hole with a door, had said the girl would be dead by February. Greta had thought Werner was probably right. "How thick are your walls?" she asked. 2.5 feet, Ingrid said. "Werner's walls are 2 inches, Greta said. "I know." They looked at each other. "You should come see it," Ingrid said. Greta came on a Wednesday, in the 2nd week of December, riding across the frozen prairie on her mare. She dismounted at the door of the sod mound and stood for a moment looking at the structure, which from the outside was indistinguishable from a naturally occurring low hill in the landscape, except for the door and the clay pipe rising from the center ridge. The pipe was putting out a thin wisp of smoke, the kind that meant a fire had burned down to coals and would die soon. She came through the door and stood inside and took her heavy coat off within 2 minutes. Not because she decided to take it off, because her body told her to. It was 58 degrees inside. The morning fire had been out for 4 hours. The temperature outside was 12 degrees Fahrenheit. The differential was 46 degrees. Greta Haas stood in the warm soddy and looked at the sod walls and the sod ceiling, and the packed clay hearth with its small stone firebox, and the single scratched window pane, and the willow sleeping platform, and the shelf cut directly into the wall itself, and said, "Werner is going to want to see this." Werner came on Saturday. He was a big man, broad through the chest, with a skepticism that expressed itself physically in the set of his shoulders and the way he looked at things from a slight angle, as if approaching them from the side allowed a clearer view of their flaws. He came through the door of the soddy and stood inside and looked at everything Ingrid showed him. The wall thickness, the sod roof construction, the way the hearth was sized to heat mass rather than air, the clay pipe angle that provided draft without pulling heat. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "What's the temperature differential you're maintaining?" She said, "I don't have a thermometer, but your wife was wearing her coat when she rode over, and she was carrying it when she left." Werner looked at Greta. 46 degrees when I came in December, Greta said. The fire had been out 4 hours. Werner said, "The walls." "The walls," Ingrid agreed. He said, 2.5 feet. "I would do 3 if I built again," she said, "but 2.5 is enough." Werner Haas left that afternoon, and Ingrid could see from the particular way he rode home, upright thinking, that he was going to try to reproduce what he had seen, and that he was going to have to decide how to explain to the people he knew that the correct approach to an Iowa winter had been demonstrated to him by a 16-year-old girl in a structure that cost $2. January of 1857 arrived with the particular cruelty that Iowa Territory Januaries had been delivering since the territory opened to settlement. The temperature dropped to -12 on the 8th and stayed there for 4 days. Niels Bergstrom, whose farm was the largest and best established in the Ridge Fork settlement, burned through 4 days of firewood in 2 days, trying to keep his frame house above 40 degrees, and sent his hired man to the creek bottom for more, with instructions to cut until he had a full week's supply extra. The hired man came back with what he could carry and said the creek bottom was cut clean for half a mile. Werner Haas went through his restored wood supply faster than he had the first time. He managed, but barely, and on the coldest night of the stretch, January 11th, the temperature inside his frame house dropped to 28 degrees in the back bedroom where his two youngest children slept. His wife, Greta, moved the children to the kitchen and fed the stove through the night and managed. But when Werner checked his remaining wood the next morning, he saw the number, and the number told him something he did not want to know. Ingrid burned 2 armloads of willow branches on January 8th, the same as every other day of the winter. The interior temperature of her soddy, which she tracked by feel with the precision she had developed over 4 months, held at approximately 51 degrees without fire, and rose to 64 with the morning and evening sessions. On the coldest night, the 11th, she built a 3rd fire session at midnight, an armload of willow she had set aside as emergency reserve, and went back to sleep in a structure holding 58 degrees, while the Iowa Territory temperature outside dropped to -16. She was not comfortable, not. 58 degrees in a space the size of 2 wagon beds, wearing a wool shirt and a blanket, burning 3 candles for light and 1 armload of wood for heat, was not a condition that anyone would choose if they had a choice. But it was survivable. It was warmly survivable, which was not the same thing as merely survivable, and the difference between those 2 conditions was exactly the difference her sod walls made. On January 13th, the temperature broke. It rose to 12 degrees, which felt warm after the previous days, and Niels Bergstrom organized his check on the outlying settlers, the kind of circuit ride the settlement did after hard cold snaps to verify that nobody had died or needed emergency assistance. He had been skeptical about including the Callahan claim on his circuit. The girl had been there since September, he knew, but the reports from Werner Haas and 1 or 2 others suggested she was managing in the sod mound, which did not seem to Niels like information he could act on with confidence. The sod mound was where his skepticism lived. He had heard about the temperature differentials Werner had measured and had dismissed the account as Werner being charitable to the girl or confused in his measurements. He added the Callahan claim to his circuit and organized 12 men and went out on the morning of January 13th into the white landscape. He found her by the smoke and knocked on the door of the hill and stood in the warm air that rolled out and watched his thermometer read 51 degrees and understood that he had been wrong. He sat at her small table and she told him about the walls and the thermal mass and the principle of heating the sod rather than the air. He listened without interrupting, which was not his natural inclination, but which the circumstances required. He was a man who believed in evidence, and the thermometer in his hand was evidence of a very particular kind. When she finished, he said, "How much did this cost?" $1.92 for materials, she said. Everything else was from the claim. He looked at the sod walls. He was 47 years old, and he had been building and maintaining frontier structures for 8 years, and he had never approached the problem the way she was describing it, had never thought about the wall as the heating element rather than the stove. He had always thought about heat as something produced by fire and delivered to air and then lost when the fire stopped. He had never thought about heat as something stored in mass and released over time. He said, "You didn't invent this. Sod houses have been built on the frontier for 20 years. No, she said, but most sod houses are built to be fast and temporary. 1 foot of sod wall, sometimes less, just enough to be a house. I built mine to be warm." He absorbed this. The distinction was simple, and it reframed everything he knew about sod construction. A thin sod wall was cheap shelter. A thick sod wall was a thermal storage system. The difference was not the material. The difference was the intention. He went back to his farm and told his wife what he had found. She was not surprised in the way he expected her to be surprised. She said, "Werner's wife told me weeks ago. I was wondering when you'd go see for yourself." He said, "Werner's measurements weren't wrong." She said, "Werner's measurements are never wrong. His opinions sometimes are. Niels Bergstrom went to the trading post 3 days later and bought enough tar paper, nails and rope for a sod addition to his barn. He did not tell anyone he was building it in consultation with what he had seen at the Callahan claim. He simply went and bought the materials and went home and started cutting sod on the south-facing slope behind his house, where the cutting was easiest. His addition took 3 weeks, and the walls were 2 feet thick, and the roof was sod over tar paper over willow poles. And when it was complete, he brought a thermometer into the new space on a January afternoon when it was 10 degrees outside, and the morning fire had been out for 5 hours, and the thermometer read 49 degrees. He sat in the addition with the thermometer and thought about the girl on the Callahan claim. Werner Haas began a sod addition to his house in late January, working in the cold because the cold had clarified the priority. He built the walls 2.5 feet thick, which was what Ingrid had specified, and he built the roof with an extra layer of sod because he had seen what the extra layer did for the insulation. He finished in early February, and his wife Greta said, standing inside the completed addition, that this was the first time since they arrived in Iowa territory that she had not been cold in February. The information about the Callahan claim, soddy spread through the Ridge Fork settlement through February and March, with the efficiency that information always moved on the frontier, through chance encounters at the trading post, through visiting and conversation, through the chain of practical urgency that connected neighbors whose survival depended on knowing what worked and what did not. 6 families asked Ingrid for advice on sod construction before spring arrived. She gave it freely and in detail, drawing diagrams in the dirt, explaining the coursing pattern, the corner construction, the roof layering, the thermal mass principle in plain terms that connected to what people already knew about the difference between a stone building and a wood building, which was the same principle working at a different scale. 3 families built additions to their existing structures that winter or in the early spring. 2 families began planning full soddy replacements for the following year. 1 family, the Peterson family, who had arrived in the territory in the fall of 1856, with inadequate preparation for their first winter, built a complete new soddy of their own, using the dimensions and construction details Ingrid had provided, finishing it in March and moving in just before the last cold snap of the season. Their fuel consumption for those last 3 weeks of winter was less than half what they had burned in their previous frame structure for comparable periods. Ingrid was not present for most of this. She was on her claim, working through late winter and early spring on the tasks that determined whether the coming growing season would give her the crop base she needed to prove the claim properly. She had borrowed a plough team from Werner Haas in exchange for a season of labor assistance and broken 10 acres of ground by the time the prairie was soft enough to work. She had planted a kitchen garden behind the soddy and a wheat plot on the eastern end of the broken ground, and had marked out the corn rows that would go in as soon as the soil temperature permitted. She went to the trading post once a week for supplies she needed, and could not produce herself. Elders Kip watched her come in each week and noted the changes, the way a person changed when they had made it through a hard thing, and the hardness had settled into them as competence rather than anxiety. He started extending her a small line of credit in March, which he had never done for someone her age. He told her it was because her account was good, which was true. She had paid every penny of what she owed him since September and had not asked for charity of any kind. In April, Niels Bergstrom came to her claim on a Sunday afternoon and proposed, formally and without embarrassment, that she consider the settlement's offer to contribute labor toward an improved structure on the Callahan claim, meaning a proper 2-room soddy of standard dimensions built to her thermal specifications, in recognition of the practical knowledge she had contributed to the settlement's winter preparation. She looked at him for a long moment. She said, "Why?" He said, "Because we were wrong to let you come here with $2.11 and nothing else and say good luck. And because the sod addition I built on my barn in January has saved me enough in fuel this winter to cover the cost of a building crew 3 times over. She was 16 years old. She had spent a winter alone in a structure she had built herself for less than $2. She had demonstrated a principle of construction that was saving families in the settlement money and discomfort and the particular frontier exhaustion of spending every cold night fighting a battle against heat loss that the walls should have been winning for them. She said, yes. The new soddy went up in 2 weekends in May with 8 men working, their labor coordinated by Werner Haas, who had become the settlement's practical expert on sod construction, in the same way that people become practical experts in things they have done recently and badly, and then done again correctly. The walls were 3 feet thick, as Ingrid had specified when Niels asked her. The interior was 16 by 20 feet, 2 rooms. The roof was 4 layers of sod, over tar paper, over willow poles, over brush, the deepest layering Werner had ever done. So heavy that they had to reinforce the ridgepole with a second lashed pole running parallel to it for support. The structure took up the old Callahan Depression as its foundation, using the 3-foot depth that Martin Callahan had left behind as the below-grade portion of the walls. The same foundation that had been available to Ingrid the previous September, and that she had recognized for what it was, a starting point, not a problem. When the new soddy was complete, Niels Bergstrom stood outside it and looked at the low profile it cut against the May prairie sky, its sod roof already beginning to show the first faint green of new grass taking hold in the fresh-cut surface, and thought about the difference between what he had expected when he heard that a 16-year-old girl had established on an abandoned claim in September and what had actually happened. He had expected to be part of a search party that found a frozen body in the spring. Instead, he had been part of a search party that found a warm room in January. The distance between those 2 outcomes was 2.5 feet of sod, and the decision to build for thermal mass rather than speed. He had thought the girl was desperate and had done what desperate people do, which was make do with inadequate materials and inadequate plans. She had been desperate. But what she had done was not making do. What she had done was look at the cheapest, most available building material in Iowa Territory and ask a different question than the one everyone else was asking. Everyone else asked, how do I build fast enough and cheap enough to get through this winter? She had asked, if I build this correctly, how warm can I actually make it? The answers to those 2 questions produced 2 entirely different structures. The first produced a thin-walled lean-to that cost $40 in lumber and let the cold in through every gap and required constant fueling to maintain a barely livable interior temperature. The second produced a $2 mound of earth that was warmer in January than most frame houses in the settlement were in October. The principle she had used was not new. Sod construction had been practiced on the American frontier since the 1830s. The thick-wall thermal mass approach was older than that, visible in the earthen dwellings of the Mandan and Hidatsa peoples of the northern plains, in the Pueblo structures of the southwest, in the ancient vernacular architectures of every cold place on Earth where people had learned to let the ground's own thermal character do the work that fire had to do otherwise. What was new was the application. What was new was a 16-year-old girl looking at an abandoned foundation and $2.11, and the Iowa winter bearing down and deciding that the correct response was not to build the cheapest minimum, but to build the most efficient possible, even if the most efficient possible looked, from the outside, like a hill. The soddy Ingrid Sorensen moved into in May of 1857 was not the structure she had built alone the previous September, but the structure she built alone in September was the reason the new one existed and the reason it was built the way it was built. Every choice in the new construction traced back to what she had learned in the old one. She lived on the Callahan claim, which became the Sorensen claim, as far as everyone in Ridge Fork was concerned, for the next several years. She proved it up formally when she turned 21 under the Homestead Act of 1862, the first year the act allowed single women to file. By that point, she had been farming the land for 5 years, and the evidence of improvement required by the act was so thoroughly established that the Land Office agent's inspection was a formality. The sod house she moved into in 1857 was still standing when she filed. Its sod roof had been replaced twice because sod roofs required periodic renewal as the root structure degraded, but the walls had never needed significant repair. 3 feet of packed earth and grass roots, properly laid and coursed and maintained at the drainage edges, was not a temporary structure. It was a permanent one that looked impermanent. She taught sod construction to 7 other settlers in the Ridge Fork area during the winters of 1857 and 1858, women and men both. She taught the thermal mass principle in the plain terms she had worked out during the winter alone. The wall is the stove. The thicker the wall, the bigger the stove. A big stone heats slowly and cools slowly. A thin board heats fast and cools fast. You want the wall to behave like stone, which means you need enough of it. She drew the diagrams in the dirt and on paper, and she answered every question, and she never charged for any of it because the knowledge was not hers to sell. It was available in every acre of Iowa prairie in the form of grass and roots and compacted earth, free for the cutting and stacking, waiting for whoever was willing to build slowly and correctly rather than fast and cheap. What the Iowa winter of 1857 taught the Ridge Fork settlement through one cold season in a $2 mound of earth was the same thing that every cold place on earth had always known and every generation had to relearn. Insulation is not a luxury, it is arithmetic. The question is not whether you can afford to build thick walls. The question is whether you can afford not to. Ingrid Sorensen could not afford not to. She had $2 and the prairie itself, and the knowledge that getting it right mattered more than getting it done quickly. She got it right, and the warmth she built into those walls at 16, the warmth she measured not in degrees but in survival, stayed in the walls of the Ridge Fork settlement's thinking for a generation. If what this girl built with $2 and a broken spade made you think differently about what ordinary people are capable of, hit that like button right now and subscribe to this channel. Drop a comment below telling me where you're watching from. And I want to know this. What is the cheapest, most ordinary thing you have ever seen someone build into something that worked better than anything expensive? Because that is the frontier story. That is always the frontier story. Leave your answer below. I read every single comment. Niels Bergstrom kept the thermometer. He kept it specifically because of the morning he stood in the sod mound doorway with it and watched it read 51 degrees in January when the air outside was -4. He kept it on the shelf in his kitchen as a reminder. His wife asked him once what the reminder was for. He said, "To check the measurement before I form the opinion." She said, "That's a hard habit." He said, "The girl had $2. She could have built $100 worth of wrong. She didn't. She built $2 worth of right." His wife thought about this. She said, "The walls." He said, "The walls." Outside the Ridge Fork settlement, the Iowa prairie stretched in every direction under the winter sky, flat and enormous and cold, and entirely willing to provide everything a person needed to survive it, if they understood how to ask. Ingrid Sorensen understood how to ask. The answer was 2.5 feet of grass and earth and roots, stacked and coursed and true. It always had been.